Hey, Eagle fans, it's EaglefanKarl and also fellow football fans. Usually I don't do a reaction video to games that aren't related to the Eagles, but there's a lot to talk about in that Super Bowl game that was played last night. So I just wanted to give some quick thoughts on what I thought about that game. First of all, if you didn't see my prediction video, I'll go ahead and put a link up there. You can click on to watch my prediction video on that. There are a few things I got right about this game. What did I get right about this game? I said that for the first three quarters, it probably really wasn't going to be that good of a game, that it wouldn't be that close, that there'd be some scores in the fourth quarter to make it closer, and that the Patriots would win the game. That's about all I got right, because I had everything else sort of flipped on its head. I thought the game would be a laugher for the Patriots for most of the game, and the Falcons would score late to sort of make it closer. Did not anticipate, obviously, what had happened, and was rooting for the Falcons, but really wasn't that invested in the game. Just really wanted to see a good game, which I got, at least for the fourth quarter. I'll get to that in a moment, how good the game was. But I do have to say that today my heart goes out to Falcons fans, because I can't imagine what I'd be feeling like if the Eagles had that kind of a lead in the Super Bowl and they turn around and blew it. Because I would just be beside myself. I probably wouldn't be able to leave my house for a month. That's how just absolutely depressed I'd be. So I can't imagine what they're going through. And if there's a Falcons fan that found the heart to watch this video, I'm sorry for you, and I can't imagine what you're feeling. But since we are talking about the Falcons and what happened in the game, I guess we really have to talk about who's to blame. And there's probably a lot of blame that can be going around. But the blame that I would put, number one, would be on Kyle Shanahan for the play calling in the fourth quarter. Specifically on the drive where you're up 28-20. You've got the ball, they just got that pass to Julio Jones that got them in field goal range. They did one running play that lost a couple yards, and then they just suddenly decided they had to pass again, forgetting the scenario of what was going on at that point in the game. Number one, you're in field goal range, and number two, the clock is your biggest ally at that point. So you don't want to get out of field goal range, and you want to keep the clock running. That suggests you should continue to run the ball, because even if you lose another yard or two, and you can design a running play that's not going to lose big yardage, unless you're at least going to stay in field goal range. There's so much wrong that can happen with a pass play. An interception, obviously, a sack, which is what ended up happening, and a holding call, which is what happened. So you just had all these things go wrong that can go wrong on a pass play. The only thing that didn't happen was an interception, but basically everything else that can go wrong on a passing play is what happened in that game. So that's why you run the ball in those situations. And I know they had a fumble earlier in the game, but that wasn't your running back. So I think this is a situation where you sort of just have to go with it and stick with the running game. And even if you don't get much more, you're in field goal range. You can make it a two-score game again, and that pretty much ices the game. So I think Kyle Shanahan, for his play calling in that situation, is the one to blame the most. Reports are he's going to San Francisco now, so I guess he's not going to have to live with that. But ultimately, that's the real thing that I think is going to come out of this in terms of who's really to blame for the Falcons losing that game, because that's really what happened. I mean, the Patriots did a great job of taking advantage, but the Falcons really lost that game. Another thing I wanted to talk about is there's been a lot of talk after this game and even before the game of greats. And specifically, I want to talk about three. Greatest coach in NFL history, greatest quarterback in NFL history, and greatest game/Super Bowl in NFL history. So first of all, with the coach, I was pretty much convinced before this game that Bill Belichick was probably one of the best coaches, if not the best coach, to ever coach in the NFL. And if anything, that opinion is even more solidified. As much as it pains me to say it, he's an old curmudgeon when he's on the field. He never looks like he's happy, even when they're winning. But at the end of the day, he gets the job done. And I think at this point, we've got to admit, is probably the greatest coach to ever coach, at least in the Super Bowl era. Because obviously Lombardi's stuff happened mostly before the Super Bowls. He did win the first two, but for the most part, his success came in the pre-Super Bowl era. So in terms of the Super Bowl era, I think you have to say at this point that Bill Belichick is the best coach to ever coach in the NFL. The next is greatest quarterback to ever play in the NFL, and I historically have said for the last few years, since Brady has pretty much gotten to where he was, and especially after last year when Peyton won his second ring, that in terms of my top quarterbacks, I would have put Joe Montana number one, Tom Brady number two, John Elway number three, Peyton Manning number 4, and then number 5, depending on what mood I'm in, I'm either going to go with Dan Marino or Brett Favre in terms of the 5th best quarterback. At least I should say this is during my time of watching, which I really started watching football around 1980 forward. So you're talking about, pretty much the last 35 years of football. Those would be the top 5 quarterbacks, 6, I guess, really, if you're talking about Manning and Favre. But those would be the top quarterbacks that I saw in NFL history. And I always made the argument that Joe Montana was better than Tom Brady, that Joe Montana never lost Super Bowls. Tom Brady had lost Super Bowls, of course. After last night's game, I think I'm finally convinced that Tom Brady is probably a better quarterback than Joe Montana. He was beaten down throughout that game. He didn't even look like himself in the first half. There was passes that he was missing that normally he would have completed. But in the fourth quarter, he just turned a switch on and he just ended up playing at another level. Unlike, I think, anything we've ever seen. Anyone, regardless of what you think about the game itself, we all have to admit, obviously just based on numbers alone, that it was the greatest comeback in Super Bowl history. So just the fact that you can do that in the fourth quarter and be down 19 going into the fourth quarter, score 19 points, and then get the ball to start off overtime and drive right down the field and score again, that was impressive. It was an impressive display of football, regardless of what you think of him as a quarterback, regardless of what you think the Patriots as a team, regardless of what you think of Belichick as a coach. What Tom Brady did last night was very impressive. So I'd, at this point, have to put him up at number 1 finally and knocking Joe Montana down to number 2. The issue I'm going to have to take, though, with people is I saw a lot of people on social media last night and even some commentators saying this was the greatest game ever in NFL history, or at least it was the greatest Super Bowl ever in NFL history. Let's not get carried away. It was the greatest comeback probably in NFL history, at least in terms of the playoffs and Super Bowl. So if you want to say that, that's fine. But this was a stinker of a game for 3 quarters. I'm sorry, it was. It was a boring game. Jen had even commented during the third quarter. She said, "This is boring," and it really was. It wasn't really all that exciting. So to say it was the greatest game ever, when you look at the whole game, I'm sorry, it wasn't. It was a very good game, and it was probably the greatest fourth quarter ever in Super Bowl history. But the game itself was not that great. Now, I'm not saying it wasn't a great Super Bowl in terms of if you look at over the course of the years of Super Bowls. But I've sort of always kept in my mind what I thought were some of the top Super Bowls. And I'd at least put 5 games above it. I would put Super Bowl 23 is always probably going to be my number 1. And that was the reason why I had Joe Montana as the best quarterback ever, is because of that game. The game-winning drive he had against the Cincinnati Bengals to finish off that game really it had been a close game the whole way, and the 49ers just got the better of it right at the end, largely due to Joe Montana. So I would always put that game at number 1. At number 2, it pains me to say it, but it's when the Giants beat the Patriots, when the Patriots were undefeated in Super Bowl 42. Huge upset. No one gave the Giants any chance of winning that game. And the way that played out, it was a close game the whole way, defensive struggle, and ultimately the Giants figure out a way to win at the end. So that obviously was one of the best Super Bowls ever. My third Super Bowl is probably Super Bowl 49 from a couple years ago with Seattle and New England, where you've got a relatively close game the whole way. The Patriots take the lead at the end. The Seahawks have a chance to take the lead at the very end, and for whatever reason, they decide to pass the ball instead of running Marshawn Lynch, and of course, everyone knows what happens with the interception. It was a close game, very intriguing, and obviously has the major call at the end that leads to a lot of discussion. In terms of my 4th best Super Bowl, I'd have to go with the upset that the Patriots had when they won their first Super Bowl, beating the greatest show on turf in Super Bowl 36. So that would be my 4th, and then my 5th one is probably going to be when John Elway upset the Green Bay Packers to win his first Super Bowl in Super Bowl 32. So I would put all those games above this particular game that we saw, only because they were all so compelling throughout the whole game, and they were competitive all the way through. So for that reason, I would put all those games above this one. This game falls more along the lines of what I have for my 6 and 7. And in my games 6 and 7, I have Super Bowl 43, which was when the Pittsburgh Steelers beat the Arizona Cardinals. Very compelling at the end, very interesting fourth quarter, but a large part of that game was rather uneventful, and the Steelers actually looked like they were going to run away with that game early on, and had the big lead at halftime, and ultimately the Cardinals came back, made a game of it, really ended up taking the lead in the fourth quarter, and then the Steelers ended up with the big drive at the end when Roethlisberger hits Santonio Holmes in the back of the end zone. So that one it's more along the lines of what we had with this game. A great ending, but the bulk of the game wasn't that good. The other one I sort of put in that same category, right along with it, where the bulk of the game wasn't that good, but the ending was fantastic. That was Super Bowl 34 when the Rams beat the Tennessee Titans, and you had losing by a yard at the very end, where the Titans just fall a yard short of tying the game. But that, once again, the Rams were in the lead for most of that game. The Titans came back and tied it up finally in the fourth quarter, and then the Rams, of course, get the go-ahead touchdown. The Titans then have a chance to tie it up and fall short. So that was a game that was sort of more along these lines, where the ending was really good and really interesting, but ultimately it really, the game itself, for the bulk of the game, was not that good. So that's sort of where I would put this one, sort of right below that upper echelon where the games were fantastic from start to finish. That's where I'd put this game. So people that are saying this was the greatest game, I think they're getting caught up in the emotion of what happened at the end, and not necessarily what happened for the whole game. If you look at the whole game, it really wasn't that interesting of a game for the first 45 minutes. But those are my thoughts. Let me know what you think. Did you think this was the greatest game ever? Do you think Tom Brady isn't the greatest quarterback? Would you put someone else there? Would you put Joe Montana? Maybe you'd put John Elway or Peyton Manning or someone like that. Let me know what you thought about the game. Let me know who you think the greatest quarterback ever is, and the greatest coach, if you disagree with me on Belichick. Let me know what you think about those things. Once again, I'm going to continue my series of position by position look at the Eagles during the offseason. Some cuts might start happening this week, so that might start to already change some of what I'm looking at, especially offensive line, which I'll be doing next. But look for that video probably coming this weekend. Until then, fly Eagles fly.